There is a door at the back of Grand Central Terminal that almost no one notices anymore. It sits at the southern end of Track 61, down a service corridor that smells of old grease and electrical heat, past a tangle of dormant switches and signals that have not moved in decades. The door is steel now, retrofitted sometime in the 1970s, but the frame around it is original, carved limestone, blackened with a century of soot, and if you look closely at the capstone you can still make out the worn shape of an acorn and an oak leaf, the Vanderbilt crest, the mark of a family that once owned more railroad track than some European nations own paved road. Behind that door is a siding, a short private spur of rail that curves away from the main terminal throat and dead ends after perhaps 200 feet in a concrete bumper stained with rust. The rails themselves are pitted and dull. Nothing has rolled over them since 1977. Nothing of consequence since the winter of 1947, when the last private car to bear the Vanderbilt name was quietly uncoupled from a Lakeshore Limited consist and shunted down this curve to sit in the dark while its owner attended a board meeting 17 floors above. The siding still exists. The monogram still exists if you know where to find it, pressed into the ironwork of a ventilation grate, half hidden behind a bank of modern electrical panels. And if you were to walk that siding today, stepping carefully over the debris of 70 years of terminal maintenance, you would eventually reach its end, where the rails simply stop, and the concrete wall of a parking garage rises up to seal off what was once the most exclusive address in American transportation. This is where we begin. Not with the grandeur, but with the silence that replaced it. Because for nearly 70 years, from the completion of the first Pullman Palace car in 1865 to an obscure Interstate Commerce Commission, ruling in 1934, there existed in America a form of wealth so concentrated, so architecturally audacious, and so deliberately invisible to the general public that most Americans never knew it was passing through their towns. Private railroad cars, rolling mansions of mahogany and marble, brass and beveled glass that could be coupled to any scheduled train in the country and carried across the continent at will. They had names instead of numbers: Idle Hour, Wanderer, Ellesmere, Atalanta, the Mark Twain. And they belonged to a handful of families whose fortunes were so intertwined with the railroads themselves that the cars were less a luxury than a logical extension of ownership. What did it mean to own one of these cars? What did it cost? Not in dollars, though we will arrive at those figures, but in the invisible machinery of human labour required to make a private palace move. And what happened to the people who spent months, sometimes years, living in the cramped service compartments at the ends of those cars, pressing shirts and polishing silver and keeping ledgers of champagne consumption while the continent scrolled past the windows? The staff letters survive. Fragments, mostly. A porter's correspondence to his wife in Chicago, a cook's inventory notes, a stenographer's diary from the summer of 1912. The railroad operational logs survive too in the archives of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, now scattered across a half-dozen university libraries, and in those documents, preserved almost by accident, is the record of a world that the owners themselves rarely described. The affairs conducted in private staterooms, the business deals signed on fold-down writing desks at 70 miles per hour, the funerals that travelled by rail because the deceased had lived by rail, and the quiet, grinding labour of the men and women who made the illusion possible. By 1934, it was over. A single regulatory ruling, dry, technical, almost unremarked at the time, made the economics of private car travel suddenly untenable. Within a decade, most of the great cars had been sold for scrap or donated to railroad museums. Within 2 decades, the sidings that had once received them were being paved over for parking lots and loading docks. Within 3, the very concept of the private railroad car had become so unfamiliar that it required explanation. But the siding at Grand Central remains, and the monogram remains, and the story, the real story, the one that happened in the service cars and the operational logs and the letters home, remains to be told. The first thing to understand about the private railroad car is that it was not, strictly speaking, a vehicle. It was a jurisdiction. Consider the legal status of the Vanderbilt car Idle Hour in the summer of 1897. The car itself was the property of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore and chairman of the New York Central Railroad. It was registered with the Association of Private Car Owners, a gentlemen's organisation that maintained standards for the construction and operation of private equipment. It carried its own insurance separate from the railroad's liability coverage, and when it was coupled to a New York Central train, which it could be at any hour with a single telegram to the division superintendent, it became, for the duration of its journey, a sovereign space. The conductor could not enter without permission. The railroad's rules regarding passenger comportment did not apply. The food served in its dining compartment was not subject to the commissary standards that governed the regular Pullman service. And the staff, the 6 to 12 people who travelled with the car to cook, clean, serve and maintain, were not railroad employees. They were personal servants of the Vanderbilt household, temporarily assigned to a moving address. This jurisdictional ambiguity was not an accident. It was the entire point. When William Henry Vanderbilt, the Commodore's son and the inheritor of the New York Central fortune, ordered his first private car in 1879, he specified that the interior fittings should be indistinguishable from those of his Fifth Avenue mansion. Not similar, indistinguishable. The same carpet suppliers, the same furniture makers, the same silver patterns and the same monogrammed linens. The car was not meant to feel like travel. It was meant to feel like home, and to carry with it all the privileges and insulations that home implied. The Vanderbilt, as it was simply called, cost $60,000 to construct. In the dollars of that year, this was more than the average American worker would earn in 3 lifetimes of continuous labour. It was also roughly the cost of a substantial house in a fashionable neighbourhood. But the Vanderbilt was not a house. It was 83 feet of rolling rosewood and burgundy velvet, with a master bedroom, a sitting room, a dining room that seated 12, a fully equipped kitchen, a wine cellar capable of holding 800 bottles, and, at the rear, a small windowless compartment where the cook, the porter and the valet shared 3 bunks stacked vertically like berths on a steamship. The staff compartment had no ventilation beyond what seeped through the door to the kitchen. In summer, temperatures in that space regularly exceeded 100 degrees. In winter, the small coal stove that heated the service area had to be monitored through the night to prevent freezing. The quarters measured 8 feet by 6 feet, with a ceiling height of 6 feet 2 inches. The staff who occupied them were expected to maintain the same standards of dress and deportment they would observe at the family's permanent residence. The Vanderbilt made its maiden voyage in March of 1880, from Grand Central to Chicago. The Vanderbilt family was not aboard. The car was being delivered to the World's Fair grounds for an exhibition. The staff made the trip alone, a 40-hour journey across the industrial heartland, tasked with keeping the silver polished, the linens fresh, and the wine at proper temperature rust for no one. The men who built these cars understood that they were constructing something unprecedented. George Pullman, whose company manufactured the majority of American sleeping and parlour cars, had made his fortune on the democratic premise that luxury travel should be available to anyone who could afford a ticket. His standard palace cars, ornate by the standards of their day, with plush seats and fold-down berths and uniformed porters to attend the passengers, were designed to democratize the experience of long-distance travel. A merchant from Des Moines could ride in the same car, sleep in the same berth, eat from the same menu as a senator from Massachusetts. But Pullman also understood that there was a tier of wealth for which democratization was not a selling point. Beginning in the 1870s, his company began offering custom-built private cars to clients who wanted something that a ticket could never buy: exclusivity. The specifications were limited only by the client's budget and the physical constraints of the American railroad gauge. A standard private car ran 80 to 90 feet in length, the maximum that could be safely coupled to a consist, and 10 feet 6 inches in width, which was the width of the loading gauge that governed clearances through tunnels and along platform edges. Within those dimensions, almost anything was possible. Jay Gould, the financier whose railroad acquisitions made him one of the most hated men in America, commissioned his private car Atalanta in 1881. The car featured a library of 300 volumes, a small pipe organ, and a bathroom with hot and cold running water supplied by a coal-fired boiler mounted beneath the floor. The bathtub was marble, the towels were monogrammed, the soap was imported from France and changed daily, whether or not the car was in use. Gould's rival, Cornelius Vanderbilt, commissioned his own car the following year, and the competition began in earnest. Each new private car had to exceed its predecessors: stained glass ceilings, electric chandeliers powered by a dedicated generator car that followed behind, refrigerated compartments for fresh flowers, a small greenhouse in one case mounted on the roof of a business car and tended by a gardener who travelled with the consist. By 1890, the American private car had reached a form that would remain essentially unchanged for 4 decades. The standard layout included a formal observation platform at the rear, with wicker furniture and a brass railing, where the family could sit and watch the scenery or, more importantly, be seen arriving at stations. A drawing room immediately inside furnished for conversation and card games, a master bedroom suite with a private bath, 1 or 2 guest bedrooms, more modestly appointed, a dining room capable of seating 8 to 12, a galley kitchen, and the staff quarters at the forward end, separated from the family spaces by a heavy door that was kept closed at all times the car was in motion. This arrangement placed the staff compartment directly above the trucks, the wheel assemblies that carried the car's weight, which meant that any irregularity in the track was felt most intensely by the servants. A rough stretch of rail that produced a gentle swaying in the master bedroom became a violent lurching in the staff bunks. This was not an oversight, it was a design choice. Her name was Letitia Graves, and she worked as a cook aboard the Vanderbilt car Idle Hour from 1896 to 1909. We know this because her son, James Graves, who became a Pullman porter himself in 1923, saved the letters she sent him during his childhood, when she was frequently away from their apartment in Harlem for weeks or months at a time, moving with the car and its family wherever the season and the social calendar demanded. The letters are not formal. They were not written for posterity. They are the hurried, affectionate, sometimes exhausted words of a mother trying to maintain a connection with a child she did not see often enough. April 14th, 1902, somewhere in Nebraska. My dear Jimmy, we have been rolling since Tuesday and I have not slept more than 3 hours together. Mrs. V had guests for dinner last night and would not hear of a simple menu, so there was soup and fish and a roast, and 3 kinds of vegetables and 2 desserts, all for 6 people, and then the dishes to do in a basin not much bigger than the one you use to wash your face. The car rocks so that I had to hold the stock pot with one hand the whole time it was on the stove. Henry says we will be in Denver tomorrow, but I do not believe him anymore. The kitchen window faces north and all I can see is prairie and more prairie, and sometimes a town that passes by in 5 seconds and is gone. I think of you in school and it helps. Learn your mathematics. It is a skill that does not require you to ride a train. I will be home by May if God wills it. Your loving mother. These letters span 13 years and several thousand miles. They document the rhythms of life in the service compartment, the inadequate ventilation, the constant motion, the meals prepared in spaces barely large enough to turn around in, the loneliness of passing through a landscape you would never be permitted to stop and see. They also document, obliquely, the lives being lived in the forward compartments, the dinner parties that required 3 days of preparation, the guests who arrived by hired carriage at remote sidings, the occasions when the car sat on a private spur for a week, while its owner conducted business that could not be discussed in the letters. Letitia Graves mentions, in a letter from the summer of 1903, that the Idle Hour had been sitting outside Pittsburgh for 4 days, and that she'd been instructed to prepare enough food for company each evening, but had never been told who the company was or when they would arrive. I have made the same dinner 6 times now, she wrote. Fillet of beef, new potatoes, asparagus in butter, each night the same. Each night the gentlemen come and go and I do not see their faces. Henry says it is best not to ask. I am learning that there are many things it is best not to ask about. Henry was Henry Washington, the porter who worked the Idle Hour during the same years as Letitia Graves. His own letters have not survived, but his name appears repeatedly in the railroad operational logs, the dry, factual records maintained by the New York Central to track the movement of private equipment across the system. From these logs, we can reconstruct his movements with surprising precision. July 12, 1903. Idle Hour departed Grand Central Station, New York, coupled to the rear of the Lakeshore Limited destination Cleveland. July 13th, 1903. Idle Hour uncoupled at Cleveland Union Terminal, shunted to private siding at Standard Oil Facility, Lakewood. July 14th to 17th, 1903. Idle Hour stationary on siding, no movement recorded. July 18th, 1903. Idle Hour coupled to westbound freight, destination Chicago. July 19th, 1903. Idle Hour arrived Chicago, Dearborn Station, uncoupled and shunted to private siding at Union Stockyards. July 19th to 23rd, 1903, idle hour stationary on siding. Notation, re-icing required daily. High temperatures. For 5 days in July 1903, Letitia Graves and Henry Washington, and whoever else formed the staff of the idle hour, sat in a private car on a siding at the Union Stockyards in Chicago, in temperatures that the Weather Bureau recorded as exceeding 95 degrees, re-icing the champagne and the butter, pressing the linens, waiting for their employer and his guests to finish whatever business had brought them to the capital of the American meatpacking industry. The operational log does not record what that business was. The letters, if there were any, have not survived. But we know what was happening at the Union Stockyards in the summer of 1903 because the newspapers covered it extensively. A price-fixing investigation, a congressional inquiry, subpoenas issued to the heads of the major meatpacking firms, who were alleged to be conspiring to control the price of beef, pork, and lamb across the entire country. The firms denied the allegations. The investigation quietly stalled, and somewhere on a private siding, behind a wall of stockyard fencing that kept the car out of public view, the idle hour sat in the heat, while deals that would never appear in any ledger were negotiated in its mahogany-panelled drawing room. The private car was, above all else, a technology of privacy. This was its primary function and the source of its value. In an age before reliable long-distance telephone service, before commercial aviation, before the secure conference room and the encrypted email, the private railroad car offered something that could not be obtained in any other way. A moving space in which conversations could be held, documents could be signed, and agreements could be reached, all while travelling at speed through landscapes where no one knew you were coming and no one could see you pass. The great business combinations of the Gilded Age, the trusts, the mergers, the market manipulations that consolidated American industry into the hands of a few dozen families, were planned in private railroad cars. Not because the cars were luxurious, though they were, not because they were symbols of wealth, though they were that too, but because they were invisible. A meeting at a corporate headquarters left records, visitors signed in, secretaries took notes, other executives saw who came and went. A meeting at a club or a hotel was worse. Waiters talked, bellhops remembered, journalists watched the entrances of fashionable establishments for signs of newsworthy activity. But a meeting in a private car parked on a siding at a remote railroad junction left no trace at all. The car was legally the private property of its owner. The staff were personal servants, bound by obligations of loyalty, and frequently by the knowledge that their continued employment depended on their discretion. No one was required to record who came aboard or when they left. No one was required to record what was discussed, and so the car became the preferred venue for the kind of conversations that could not afford to be overheard. The Wanderer was built in 1892 for William Seward Webb, who had married Eliza Vanderbilt and thereby joined himself to the railroad dynasty. The car was 85 feet long and featured an interior decorated in what the Pullman Company described as Moorish revival. Carved screens, brass lanterns, silk cushions in jeweled colours, and a ceiling painted to resemble a night sky, with small electric bulbs positioned to represent the constellations as they would appear over the Mediterranean. Webb had never been to Morocco. He had visited the Alhambra once in his 20s, and the memory of it, or his imagination of the memory, had calcified into this fantasy of oriental luxury rolling through the cornfields of Indiana and the factory towns of Ohio. The Wanderer carried a staff of 8, a porter, a cook's assistant, a maid, a valet, a stenographer, and 2 additional servants whose roles shifted according to need. All of them slept in a compartment that measured 12 feet by 8 feet, larger than most private car service quarters, a point of which Webb was apparently proud. The compartment was located, unusually, in the centre of the car rather than at the forward end, sandwiched between the galley and the baggage storage, because Webb wanted the observation platform at the rear to be as far from the servant noise as possible. This placement meant that the staff slept directly beneath the dining room. On nights when Webb entertained, the staff could hear every word spoken above them, the clink of crystal, the scrape of chair legs, the rise and fall of voices discussing matters that ranged from the mundane, the performance of a particular racehorse, to the consequential, the proposed merger of 2 Midwestern rail lines that would later prompt a Supreme Court antitrust action. Eleanor Tinsley, who worked as a maid aboard the Wanderer from 1898 to 1904, described this experience in a memoir she wrote late in life. after Webb was dead and the car itself had been sold for scrap. "We heard everything," she wrote. "We heard when Mr. Webb argued with his business partners. We heard when Mrs. Webb wept over letters from her sister. We heard things that would have been worth money to the newspapers if we had ever thought to sell them. But we did not think of it that way. We thought only of the morning when we would have to face them at breakfast and pretend we had heard nothing. After a while, you learn not to hear. You learn to listen to the wheels instead, the rhythm of the track, and to let the voices become just another kind of noise." The stenographer who travelled with the Wanderer was a man named Patrick Dunleavy, and his role was one that blurred the line between servant and professional. Dunleavy was responsible for taking dictation whenever Webb chose to conduct business correspondence while in transit. He maintained a portable typewriter mounted on a special dampened bracket that absorbed the vibrations of the car's motion. He drafted telegrams, composed letters, filed documents in a rolling cabinet that had been specially designed to match the Moorish interior while providing the same organisational capacity as a standard office, and he took notes. Dunleavy's notes have survived, in fragments, in the Webb family papers at Yale. They are dry, professional documents, minutes of conversations, summaries of agreements, drafts of contracts intended to be recopied in fair hand once the car arrived at its destination. But embedded in their formality are the traces of transactions that never appeared in any public record. August 4th, 1899, en route Cleveland to Chicago. Present, West-Southwest, J. Gould Jr., R. Price, Attorney, P. Dunleavy, Recording. Discussion of Eastern Freight Rate Agreement. J.G. proposes uniform pricing across trunk lines, NYC to Chicago, effective September 1st. W.S.W. objects to timing. Political climate unfavourable. Compromise. Implementation delayed to January. Announcement time to follow congressional recess. R.P. to draft memorandum of understanding. Not for filing. Not for filing was a phrase that appeared frequently in Dunleavy's notes. It indicated that the document in question was to be destroyed after its contents had been acted upon. How many were actually destroyed is impossible to know. The ones that survived did so only because they were misfiled with routine correspondence, or because Dunleavy, for reasons of his own, chose to keep copies. The effect of these documents, read together with the operational logs and the staff letters, is to illuminate a shadow economy of American capitalism, one conducted at 70 miles per hour, behind beveled glass windows, by men who understood that the railroads they owned had given them something more valuable than wealth. They had given them the power to move through the country unseen. They had given them a jurisdiction of their own, answerable to no one, recorded by no one except the servants who had learned not to hear. But the servants did hear, and some of them eventually chose to speak. The summer of 1912 brought the Mark Twain to upstate New York for what the Gould family described as a restful retreat at their estate near Tarrytown. The Mark Twain, named not for the writer but for the pilot's call on the Mississippi riverboats, a reminder of Jay Gould's early investments in Western transportation, was among the most opulent cars in America. It had been rebuilt twice since its original construction in 1889, each renovation adding new comforts: a barbershop, a gymnasium with wall-mounted Indian clubs and a rowing machine, a small dark room for developing photographs, a safe large enough to hold the bearer bonds and stock certificates that Jay Gould's son George carried with him wherever he travelled. George Gould was not a well man in the summer of 1912. His health, strained by years of legal battles over his father's estate and by a series of disastrous investments in Western Railroad expansion, was failing. He had come to Tarrytown to rest, though rest was not something that George Gould understood how to do. Instead, he spent his days in the observation car receiving visitors, reviewing financial statements, and dictating a stream of letters and telegrams that kept Patrick Dunleavy's successor, a young man named William Morrow, occupied from breakfast to midnight. Morrow kept a diary. Unlike Dunleavy's formal notes, Morrow's diary was personal, intended for no one's eyes but his own. It recorded, in addition to the routine complaints of a young man working 18-hour days in a confined space, his observations of the Gould family's private conduct. July 15th, 1912. The old man is worse today. I can hear him coughing through the wall. His daughter came by rail this afternoon and they argued for an hour about the sale of the Missouri Pacific shares. She wants him to sell. He refuses. He says it would be a betrayal of his father's memory. She says his father would have sold them 3 years ago when they were worth something. I pretended not to hear, but there is no not hearing in this car. The walls are mahogany, not brick. The coughing continued through the night. Morrow noted it again the next morning, then the morning after that, then stopped noting it altogether because it had become the rhythm of life aboard the Mark Twain, as constant as the creak of the trucks over rail joints, as the hiss of steam from the heating system, as the low murmur of the porter brewing coffee in the galley before dawn. George Gould died 14 months later, in May of 1923, not in his private car but in a rented villa in the south of France, having finally sold the Missouri Pacific shares at a fraction of what they had once been worth. By then, the Mark Twain had been sold as well, passed through a succession of owners, a mining magnate from Colorado, a meatpacking heir from Kansas City, a movie producer who used it twice and then forgot about it, before ending up in a rail yard outside Philadelphia, where it sat on a siding for 11 years, its gymnasium equipment rusting, its mahogany panelling warped by moisture, its safe emptied of everything except a single, unsigned stock certificate from a railroad that no longer existed. The story of the Mark Twain was not unusual. By the early 1920s, the private railcar was entering its twilight, not because the technology had failed, and not because the fortunes that supported them had evaporated, though many had. The private car was dying because the country around it was changing, and because the men who had once used these cars to move invisibly through that country were discovering that invisibility was no longer possible. The first blow had come in 1906 with the Hepburn Act. The law had been aimed at the railroads themselves, at the rebates and kickbacks and secret rate agreements that had allowed men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould to dominate American commerce. But one of its lesser provisions touched the private cars directly. It required that all railroad traffic, including private cars, be subject to uniform regulation by the Interstate Commerce Commission. For the first time, the movement of a private car had to be documented in the same logs as freight and common passengers. For the first time, someone was watching. The second blow came in 1913 with the ratification of the 16th Amendment. The income tax created for the first time a federal apparatus capable of examining wealth. The private car, long treated as a personal expense invisible to any accounting, suddenly became a liability. How could a man explain the maintenance of a vehicle that cost $30,000 a year to operate? How could he justify the salaries of a permanent staff of 8 or 10 or 12? The cars themselves were not taxed, but the money that flowed through them now had to be accounted for, and accounting was the enemy of everything the private car had been designed to provide. The third blow was the automobile. Henry Ford's Model T had been a curiosity when it was introduced in 1908. By 1920, there were more than 8 million automobiles on American roads. The private car had offered its owners the freedom to travel without schedules, without the inconvenience of public timetables and public stations. But the automobile offered something the railroad could never match: the freedom to go where no tracks had been laid, the freedom to stop wherever one chose, to change direction on a whim, to travel roads that existed on no map. For the sons and daughters of the men who had built the private cars, the automobile was irresistible. It was newer, it was faster, it was modern in a way that a railroad car, however magnificent, could never be. By 1925, the private car had become a relic, still used by a handful of families who maintained them out of traditional stubbornness, but no longer central to the way American wealth moved through American space. The Idle Hour made its last journey in 1927, carrying William K. Vanderbilt II to a funeral in Newport, Rhode Island. The Wanderer had been retired 3 years earlier, its fittings auctioned off to pay estate taxes. The great era was over. What remained was paperwork. And in 1934, the Interstate Commerce Commission set out to finish what the Hepburn Act had begun. The ICC ruling of October 1934 was not, on its face, about private cars at all. It was about trackage rights, about the fees that railroads charged each other for the use of their lines, and about the special arrangements that had allowed certain customers to avoid those fees entirely. The private car owners were among those customers. For decades, the families who owned private cars had paid for the privilege of having their cars attached to scheduled trains, but they had not paid the full cost of the trackage their cars occupied. They had been subsidised, in effect, by the common passengers and freight shippers who paid full fare. The ICC ruling ended that subsidy. Effective January 1st, 1935, All private cars would be required to pay trackage fees at commercial rates that, in some cases, tripled or quadrupled the cost of operating a private car. The ruling also imposed new inspection requirements, new safety standards, and new reporting obligations that made the casual use of a private car effectively impossible. The Vanderbilts challenged the ruling in court. So did the Goulds, or what remained of them. So did a consortium of private car owners organised by a Chicago attorney named Harold Sutherland, who argued that the ICC had exceeded its statutory authority and that the ruling amounted to an unconstitutional taking of private property. The challenges failed. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case. By the summer of 1935, the private rail car was, for all practical purposes, illegal. Not illegal in the sense that ownership was prohibited. A family could still own a rail car, could still maintain it, could still furnish it with marble baths and mahogany panelling, and employ a permanent staff to see to its upkeep. But a family could no longer attach that car to a scheduled train without paying fees that made the exercise pointless. A family could no longer move through the country as the Vanderbilts and Goulds had moved, invisibly, accountably to no one, exempt from the rules that governed ordinary travel. The ECC ruling did not destroy the private cars, it destroyed the world that had made them possible. The staffs dispersed. The porters and valets and cooks and stenographers who had spent years aboard these rolling mansions found themselves, suddenly, unemployed, or rather employed in ways they had never expected. Some returned to the hotels and private homes where they had worked before entering private car service. Some took positions with the commercial railroads, working as porters on Pullman sleepers or dining car waiters on long-distance routes. A few wrote memoirs, though the memoirs were rarely published. The families who had employed them had long memories and longer legal budgets, and any servant who revealed too much could expect to be silenced. But the letters survived. The diaries survived. The operational logs, filed in railroad archives and later transferred to university libraries, survived. And through them, a vanished world can still be glimpsed. Not the world as the Vanderbilts and Goulds wished it to be remembered, but the world as it was actually lived, in cramped end cars and galley kitchens and narrow berths separated from the master's quarters by nothing but mahogany and discretion. What the letters reveal, more than anything else, is exhaustion. The glamour of private car service was a myth sustained by those who had never experienced it. The reality was 18-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week, in a space that offered no privacy and no escape. The reality was serving meals at 2 a.m. because a guest was hungry, and then cleaning up after those meals and then preparing for breakfast, and then standing ready in case the master required something else. The reality was knowing that one's employment depended on absolute silence, on never hearing what was said in the dining car, on never seeing what happened in the staterooms, on never remembering anything that might embarrass the family if repeated. "I am 31 years old," wrote Samuel Price, a porter on the Idle Hour, in a letter to his sister dated March 1904. "I feel 50. My back aches constantly. My feet are swollen every night. I have not seen my wife in 4 months, and I do not know when I will see her again. But I am paid well, and the work is steady, and there are men who would take my place tomorrow if I gave it up. So I do not give it up. I stand where I am told to stand, and I carry what I am told to carry, and I remember nothing." He remembered nothing. That was the bargain. That was the price of employment in the rolling palaces of the Gilded Age. The staff were paid to be invisible, and invisibility required forgetting. It required the systematic erasure of one's own experience in service of someone else's comfort. The irony is that their forgetting preserved nothing. The things they were paid not to see, the affairs, the deals, the arguments about money, the slow decay of families that had once seemed immortal, all of it was recorded anyway, in letters to sisters, in diaries kept for private comfort, in notes that were supposed to be destroyed but somehow weren't. The forgetting was performance. The remembering was real. What happened to the cars themselves is a story of slow dispersal and slower decay. The Idle Hour was sold to a railroad museum in 1941, where it was displayed for 3 decades before a fire destroyed the building in which it was housed. The car survived, its steel frame too heavy to burn completely, but its interior was gutted. The marble bath that had once been photographed for the Century magazine was reduced to a heap of cracked tiles. The mahogany dining car, where Cornelius Vanderbilt had entertained presidents and senators and railroad commissioners, was nothing but char and ash. What remained was shipped to a salvage yard in New Jersey, where it sat for another 15 years before being sold for scrap. The Wanderer fared slightly better. It passed through a series of private owners, none of them Pullmans, before being acquired in 1958 by a consortium of railroad enthusiasts who restored it to something approximating its original condition. The restoration was not entirely accurate. The original upholstery had been a deep burgundy velvet, but the restorers used a maroon fabric that was close enough for most purposes. The original safe, which had held George Pullman's personal correspondence and, according to one account, a pistol he kept loaded at all times, had been removed decades earlier and could not be located. In its place, the restorers installed a period-appropriate safe purchased from an antique dealer in St. Louis. The Wanderer is still in existence, housed in a climate-controlled facility in Illinois, available for viewing by appointment only. The Mark Twain was destroyed. Not by fire and not by deliberate demolition, but by neglect, the slowest and most thorough form of destruction. After its years in the Philadelphia rail yard, the car was sold to a speculator who intended to convert it into a restaurant. The conversion never happened. The speculator defaulted on his loans. The car was seized by creditors, and for the next 20 years it sat on a siding in rural Pennsylvania, its windows broken, its roof leaking, its gymnasium equipment and darkroom and barbershop chair all ruined by rain and snow and the slow, patient work of rust. In 1967, a historian named Margaret Cousins travelled to Pennsylvania to photograph what remained of the Mark Twain. She found a shell. The mahogany panelling had been stripped by scavengers. The fittings had been sold. The safe, the same safe that had once held Jay Gould's bearer bonds, was gone, cut out of the car's frame with an acetylene torch and hauled away by persons unknown. What remained was steel and rust, and the faint outline of where the walls had once been. Cousins took 37 photographs. In one of them, barely visible beneath a layer of grime, is the monogram that had been painted on the car's side when it was rebuilt in 1902. The interlocking letters MWT for Mark Twain, surmounted by a small silhouette of a riverboat. The monogram is faded almost to invisibility. Another winter, another spring, and it would be gone entirely. There is a siding at Grand Central Terminal in New York City that has not been used in more than 70 years. It is located beneath the main concourse in a section of the terminal that was once reserved for private car arrivals. The siding is still there, still connected technically to the tracks that feed into the terminal's lower level, but the tracks are rusted. The platform is covered in dust. The electrical connections that once powered the lighting and heating systems of the private cars have been disconnected for decades. No train has arrived at this platform since 1953, when the last private car to use Grand Central, owned by a textile magnate whose name no one remembers, was detached from an overnight train from Chicago. At the end of the platform, barely visible in the dim light, is a brass plate set into the wall. The plate is tarnished almost black. If you polish it, and no one has polished it in decades, you can make out a monogram, the interlocking letters CV, surmounted by a small locomotive. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man who built the terminal, the man whose family had built an empire on the rails, and who had travelled those rails in cars that were palaces, attended by servants who were paid to remember nothing. The monogram is still there. The empire is gone. The cars are gone, scrapped or burned or rusted into oblivion. The servants who staffed them are gone, their letters and diaries scattered across a dozen archives, their voices preserved only in fragments. What remains is brass and rust, and the faint echo of a world that once moved through this country at 70 miles per hour, behind beveled glass windows, answerable to no one. The platform is silent now. The tracks are cold. The dust settles slowly, undisturbed, onto a brass plate that bears a name no one comes to read. And beneath the streets of New York, in the darkness that the Vanderbilts once owned, the monogram waits. It will outlast everyone who remembers what it meant.